Freeside's story begins long before the shanties, long before the Kings claimed their ruined schoolhouse, long before the atomic wrangler began preying on the desperate, and even long before Securitrons watched the gates that divided the fortunate from the forgotten. In truth, its roots stretch back into the glittering neon decades of pre-war Las Vegas, a city whose identity was defined by excess, tourism, and the economic stratification beneath its polished surface. Because to understand Freeside, one must first understand what Las Vegas was designed to be, and how the nuclear fire that fell in 2077 reshaped not just its skyline, but the very logic of survival around it. Pre-war Las Vegas occupied an unusual place in American culture, thriving even as the nation spiraled into the chaos of the resource wars, where other cities felt the crushing effects of energy shortages, rationing policies, and increasing martial oversight. Las Vegas remained a bastion of entertainment and escapism, fueled by a fusion of tourism, corporate interests, and the city's unique ability to reinvent itself with each passing decade, transforming from a desert outpost into the world's gambling capital. By the 2062nd and 2072nd, the Mojave region had already begun to experience the geopolitical tremors shaking the rest of the world, but Las Vegas maintained its brightly lit illusion through shrewd economic maneuvering and the growing influence of Robert Edwin House, whose corporate vision and technological prowess allowed the city to flourish even as global tensions reached a breaking point. Mr. House understood that the survival of Las Vegas required more than tourism. It required independence, automation, and the elimination of external vulnerabilities, which led him to construct the Securitron policing infrastructure, expand Robco's influence, and install the defense systems that would ultimately save the city from total annihilation. When the Great War erupted on the 23rd of October 2077, a conflict that lasted mere hours, yet extinguished centuries of human achievement, Las Vegas escaped the fate suffered by nearly every major American city. Thanks to House's automated missile interception algorithms, the vast majority of nuclear payloads targeting the region were neutralized before impact, sparing the heart of the city from obliteration, though the outer neighborhoods and the wider Mojave still suffered blast effects, infrastructure collapse, population death, and the slow devastation that radioactive fallout inevitably brings. In the chaotic months following the war, the Mojave's scattered survivors were forced to confront the harsh reality of a world without functioning government, consistent water sources, or stable trade networks. The desert, once traversed by highways and lights, became a fractured landscape of scavenger bands, displaced families, and violent groups competing for the remnants of pre-war supplies. The areas surrounding the still-standing strip, precincts that would eventually become Freeside, were initially a mixture of abandoned suburbs, partially ruined casinos, and looted commercial districts, inhabited by survivors who saw Las Vegas's intact structures as both a beacon of hope and a promise of resources worth fighting over. With Mr. House sealed away inside the Lucky 38, maintaining his life through the extraordinary technologies he had designed, the city remained dormant and leaderless for nearly 2 centuries. During this time, the Mojave wasteland continued to evolve, as tribal cultures emerged from fractured survivor groups, each adopting new identities and survival strategies, some turning to nomadism, others creating small settlements around salvageable wells or pre-war infrastructure. The region's gradual repopulation created new oral histories, local power structures, and rivalries, setting the stage for the cultural tapestry that would later define Freeside itself. For generations, the ruins near the Strip served as both a refuge and a battleground. Scavengers combed the derelict casinos for pre-war technology. Opportunists exploited travelers, and early proto-tribal groups used abandoned storefronts as makeshift bases. Without formal governance, these areas developed an informal and often brutal rule of survival, where disputes were settled through force, and communities survived only through mutual aid or the protection of influential individuals. This was the raw, unfiltered environment that existed when Mr. House finally reactivated his citywide infrastructure in 2274, sweeping the Mojave with Securitron enforcers and reasserting control over the Strip. House's reappearance dramatically redefined the surrounding districts. The tribes he encountered were not simply wiped out, but integrated, re-educated, and reshaped into the three families: Gomorrah, the Tops, and the Ultralux, who would operate the casinos under his supervision. But while House incorporated these groups into his new vision for New Vegas, he deliberately left the outskirts, the soon-to-be Freeside, outside his sphere of direct investment, enforcing a boundary between the elite inner Strip and the unregulated wasteland beyond, resulting in a socio-economic divide that would become the defining feature of Freeside. Desperate settlers, aspiring merchants, displaced tribespeople, and drifters naturally gravitated toward the edges of the Strip, seeking opportunity in proximity to its wealth, while being barred entry without caps, connections, or purpose, creating a dense and culturally diverse population of the hopeful and the desperate, living in the shadow of enormous, fully powered casinos they could see but rarely enter. As small groups of settlers formed households, markets, and defensive arrangements, the nascent identity of Freeside began to take shape, forged from improvisation and the shared challenges of living just outside a technological utopia that would not claim them. Over time, the district became known as a place where one could find nearly anything: food, weapons, temporary shelter, mercenaries, doctors, con artists, and chem dealers, but rarely at a price that reflected fairness or safety. Its reputation spread widely through the Mojave as both a gateway to the Strip and a dangerous gauntlet filled with pickpockets, thugs, and opportunists who preyed on newcomers unfamiliar with its labyrinth of ruined buildings and narrow alleys. This dual identity, opportunity versus peril, is what ultimately set Freeside apart from other wasteland settlements. It was uniquely positioned between abundance and poverty, order and disorder, high technology and improvised survival. As Mr. House stabilized the Strip and the NCR expanded eastward, Freeside became a contact zone for travelers, soldiers, traders, and refugees, each bringing their own pressures and conflicts. The continual influx of people created overcrowding, competition for resources, and a delicate balance of power among local groups, especially as the followers of the apocalypse established their headquarters in the old Mormon fort and began offering humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, charismatic leadership began to emerge among the growing population, setting the groundwork for the kings and other influential factions who would shape Freeside's social order. All of these developments were rooted in the post-war history of Las Vegas itself, a city saved by the brilliance of one man, surrounded by neighborhoods abandoned to chaos, rebuilt not by intention but by the desperate determination of those who refused to leave. Freeside, in this sense, was never designed. It was born. slowly and unevenly, from the ruins of a world that once promised wealth and comfort, shaped by decades of hardship, migration, violence, and resilience. It is the living legacy of the Mojave Wasteland's transformation after 2077, the testament to what happens when a shining city survives, but the world around it does not, leaving its borders crowded with those who seek a future close to glory, but separated from it by the cold reality of scarcity, indifference, and the harsh arithmetic of wasteland life. The rise of the Kings in Freeside represents one of the most fascinating evolutions of post-war identity in the Mojave, a story not simply of a gang forming in the ruins of a devastated city, but of a social movement taking shape around an old-world relic, adopting the ideals, real or imagined, connected to a long-dead cultural icon, and turning those ideals into a practical system of community cohesion, self-defense, and territorial control. And to understand their emergence, one must trace the path from the shattered streets of proto-Freeside to the moment the tribe encountered the strange pre-war artifacts that would define their destiny. In the years following Mr. House's reactivation of the Strip around 2274, the neighborhoods just beyond the casino walls experienced rapid population growth as more travelers, merchants, refugees, and opportunists entered the Mojave, all of whom congregated in Freeside due to its proximity to trade routes and its perceived connection to the wealth of New Vegas. With this population boom came increased violence, muggings, extortion, turf conflicts, and predation became a daily reality for settlers attempting to carve out a stable existence in an environment without formal governance or consistent security. The Securitrons guarding the Strip gates cared nothing for what happened outside House's narrow jurisdiction, and the NCR presence at McCarran, though expanding, did not involve itself in policing civilian areas unless NCR personnel or assets were directly threatened. In this vacuum of authority, emergent groups formed in response to necessity, some violent, some cooperative, but none capable of unifying Freeside's fractured population. These early groups, small bands of wastelanders, proto-tribes, and fortified households, lacked the central leadership or ideological cohesion required to maintain territory, and most dissolved as quickly as they formed. Freeside's turning point arrived when one of these tribal collectives stumbled upon an abandoned pre-war educational facility filled with memorabilia dedicated to a single performer, Elvis Presley. The building, once a themed school and cultural institution honoring the music and aesthetic of the mid-20th century, contained posters, costumes, instructional materials, recordings, and even mannequins dressed in Presley's iconic jumpsuits. To the wastelanders who discovered it, people whose cultural reference points had been shattered by 2 centuries of survival, these materials represented not merely entertainment artifacts but a window into a forgotten world, a world that to their eyes seemed glamorous, confident, and unified around a charismatic figure whose image radiated authority. Because no living person in the Mojave had the context necessary to understand Elvis as a musician or celebrity, they instead interpreted him as a leader, a man of immense influence whose look and style conveyed strength and direction. From these misunderstandings emerged something entirely new, a tribal identity built around imitation, reverence, and aesthetics. The group began to adopt Elvis's mannerisms, as best they could decipher them from surviving media, practicing his drawl, mimicking his swagger, and crafting their hair into towering pompadours made with whatever products or wasteland substitutes they could obtain, all while designing outfits inspired by the rhinestone-covered jumpsuits they found in the school. This performative imitation evolved from novelty into structure, as the tribe's growing population began to view these mannerisms as symbols of belonging, a shared identity, marking them as members of a group distinct from the chaotic mesh of Freeside's other residents. Under the guidance of a charismatic young man known simply as the King, the tribe embraced their newfound aesthetic not as parody but as a code of conduct, an ethos that blended stylized confidence with a protective sense of community. The King displayed an unusual combination of charisma, fairness, and pragmatism. While he modeled himself on the image of Elvis, his leadership came from his own qualities: a strong instinct for diplomacy, an ability to read people, and a clear vision for stabilizing the environment around the school they had claimed as their headquarters. As more settlers came seeking protection or affiliation, the King realized that his group's survival depended on transforming from an aesthetic tribe into an organization capable of enforcing order. He began organizing patrols through nearby streets, mediating disputes, and developing a reputation for defending locals against predators. These actions gradually established the Kings as the de facto authority in central Freeside, a position solidified by their refusal to extort tribute from residents, an unusual stance in a region dominated by opportunists. Instead, they sought loyalty through presence and reliability, which in turn attracted recruits. Their distinct appearance served an important psychological function. Potential adversaries recognized the pompadours, the swagger, and the uniformity of dress from a distance, creating an image of a unified group with enough discipline to hold territory. As their numbers grew, the Kings began codifying internal roles. Some members took responsibility for offering guidance to newcomers. Some practiced the preserved dance steps and mannerisms of Elvis as a form of cultural ritual, and others trained as protectors, ensuring that the Kings maintained a strong physical presence capable of deterring threats. They also developed an informal legal system. Minor disputes were settled through mediation, while serious offenses, those threatening the stability of Freeside, were addressed through coordinated intervention by the most disciplined members. The King maintained personal oversight of major conflicts, earning him widespread respect not only among his own followers, but among neutral residents who saw his tribe as a stabilizing force. It was during this period that Freeside began to experience something resembling structured order, however imperfect. While poverty remained rampant and violence could not be entirely eradicated, the presence of the Kings created zones of relative safety around their headquarters, transforming nearby blocks into semi-governed spaces where merchants could operate without constant fear of being robbed. The Kings' approach to recruitment was similarly notable. They did not limit membership to a particular background or ethnicity, but instead accepted anyone who embraced their culture and pledged to uphold the group's code. This inclusive policy allowed the Kings to grow rapidly, their ranks filled with orphans, refugees, and wastelanders eager for a sense of identity. Despite this growth, however, the Kings were not a monolithic entity. Internal tensions sometimes rose as younger, more hot-headed recruits struggled to align their impulses with the group's ideals. The King countered this by promoting mentorship and establishing a hierarchy that emphasized responsibility rather than domination. Still, trouble occasionally arose when members acted independently, leading to conflicts that the King had to resolve personally. As the Kings became Freeside's dominant power, other groups began adapting in response. Smaller gangs avoided direct confrontation, and many chose to operate on the fringes of Freeside rather than challenge the king's authority. Merchants, recognizing the advantages of working in an area with some form of protection, gravitated toward king-controlled streets, creating a local economy that reinforced the tribe's position. But the king's rise also drew the attention of external powers. The NCR, expanding into the Mojave in the years leading up to the events of Fallout, New Vegas, viewed Freeside as strategically important due to its proximity to the Strip and its role as a transit hub for travelers entering New Vegas. NCR agents began to appear in limited numbers, offering food and support to Freeside residents in an attempt to cultivate goodwill. But their presence created tension. Many kings saw NCR involvement as a threat to their autonomy and resented what they perceived as political manipulation. Though outright conflict was avoided at this early stage, distrust between the kings and NCR would continue to simmer, eventually boiling over as NCR influence increased. In addition to external pressures, the kings had to contend with internal challenges triggered by their own success. As the group became synonymous with stability in Freeside, residents increasingly turned to them for help resolving issues that exceeded the tribe's resources: food shortages, medical needs, housing disputes, and the growing crisis surrounding access to water, problems large enough that even the king could not solve them alone. This forced the kings to reassess their role in Freeside's social order, balancing their identity as protectors with the realities of governance. Their interactions with the followers of the apocalypse became increasingly important during this period. While the kings provided security, the followers provided medical care, education, and humanitarian aid. Though their philosophies differed, cooperation between the two groups allowed Freeside to function in ways that would have been impossible without either party. Ultimately, the founding of the kings marked the beginning of Freeside's transition from a chaotic wasteland district into a territory with recognizable leadership and social structure. They provided identity in a place defined by uncertainty, protection in a place defined by danger, and unity in a place defined by fragmentation. Their rise demonstrates the Mojave's remarkable capacity for cultural reinvention, where a pre-war myth could become the foundation for a post-war society, and where style became substance simply because people needed something to believe in. The kings did not merely imitate the past, they reinterpreted it, reshaping the ruins of old-world culture into a community that would define Freeside's character for decades to come. The arrival and entrenchment of the followers of the apocalypse in Freeside stands as one of the Mojave Wasteland's most remarkable examples of idealism surviving against overwhelming adversity. For their decision to establish their primary New Vegas headquarters in the old Mormon fort transformed the district from a lawless buffer zone into a battleground of conflicting philosophies, where hope and desperation collided daily. And to understand their influence, one must examine both the origins of the followers and the unique pressures that shaped their evolution in this harsh environment. The followers themselves trace their roots to the chaotic decades following the Great War, when the multidisciplinary intellectuals, scientists, and pacifist thinkers of the pre-war Boneyard Library coalesced into a movement dedicated to preserving knowledge, aiding communities, and fostering self-sufficiency rather than dominance, a mission that placed them at odds with expansionist powers such as the NCR, whose early growth relied heavily on centralized authority and military action. Yet the followers maintained their belief that education and humanitarianism offered a sustainable alternative to the cycles of conquest that had defined post-war civilization. When the Mojave opened to greater travel and settlement in the 23rd century, the followers saw Las Vegas as a region uniquely in need of their presence. A growing population of refugees, addicts, roaming tribes, and desperate settlers surrounded one of the most technologically advanced strongholds in the wasteland. And yet, the Strip's wealth remained locked behind its walls, leaving Freeside as a pressure cooker of disease, hunger, and violence with almost no institutional support. Recognizing this imbalance, senior followers, led by figures such as Julie Farkas, made the strategic decision to occupy the surviving walls of the old Mormon fort, a structure sturdy enough to be defensible yet open enough to function as a community hub. And from the moment they arrived, they became the only group in Freeside offering consistent medical care, clean water distribution, educational programs, and conflict mediation, all provided without cost and funded through a patchwork of donations, salvaged resources, and the efforts of volunteers. Their work was not simply altruistic but deeply strategic. The followers believed that empowering communities prevented the rise of authoritarian systems, and Freeside, perched directly on the border of Mr. Rise, House's autocratic strip and increasingly under the watch of NCR political interests, served as a testing ground for whether grassroots humanitarianism could survive when caught between two competing powers, both of which viewed Freeside's population not as citizens, but as assets or obstacles. Inside the fort's courtyard, the followers built functioning clinics, staffed by medics trained to improvise without the advanced supplies available inside the Strip, salvaging pre-war equipment, repurposing old tools, and training locals in first aid to create a broader base of community support. Every day they treated knife wounds, malnutrition, radiation sickness, dehydration, and chem withdrawal, often working under the constant threat of violence spilling into their camp from the surrounding streets. Their proximity to the Kings fostered an uneasy but ultimately productive alliance. While the Kings maintained physical order in the streets, the followers offered services that reduced desperation. And over time, both groups realized that the survival of Freeside depended on cooperation rather than rivalry. A relationship strengthened through individuals like the King, who respected the followers' compassion even if he did not always share their worldview. But the followers' presence also made them targets, for Freeside was a haven for addicts, pushers, and criminal elements who profited from the suffering the followers sought to alleviate, and every cure, every food handout, every rehabilitated addict cut into the revenue of dealers, thugs, and slumlords whose livelihoods depended on misery. As a result, the followers frequently found themselves threatened, robbed, or extorted, and though they refused to arm themselves for offense, they were forced to maintain basic defensive measures and rely on their alliances within Freeside for protection. Their most difficult work, however, came with the spiraling addiction crisis gripping the district, where cheap, easily produced chems such as jet were poured into the community by criminal networks that exploited Freeside's poverty and lack of regulation. The followers attempted detox programs, counseling, and long-term rehabilitative support, but with limited supplies and an ever-growing influx of chemically dependent residents, their efforts became a daily struggle that strained morale and resources alike. NCR involvement added another layer of complexity. While many individual NCR personnel respected the followers, the organization as a whole distrusted them, viewing their decentralized structure, their anti-authoritarian philosophy, and their refusal to endorse NCR policy as obstacles to stabilization and NCR relief efforts in Freeside were often designed not to assist the population but to win political support, creating friction with followers like Julie Farkas, who openly criticized the NCR's selective aid. Meanwhile, Mr. House acknowledged the followers' usefulness but did nothing to support them materially, seeing Freeside as a buffer zone whose hardships ultimately served his interests by discouraging poor wastelanders from overwhelming the Strip. In spite of these pressures, the followers remained the heart of Freeside. They educated children who had never seen a functioning school, taught settlers how to purify water and grow limited crops in the Mojave's unforgiving soil, documented the region's history, and spearheaded efforts to keep violence from spiraling beyond control. Their influence extended beyond medical care or charity by creating spaces where people could gather safely, learn skills, and cultivate dignity. The followers effectively became Freeside's moral compass, a counterweight to the predatory forces that otherwise shaped daily life. Their presence also provided an ideological foundation that would later influence major events in New Vegas, including the interactions between the Courier and various factions. For Julie Farkas and her colleagues understood both the fragility and the potential of Freeside better than anyone, recognizing that its people were capable of building a stable community if given the chance. Ultimately, the followers' role in Freeside was defined not by the supplies they distributed or the wounds they healed, but by the ideals they embodied. The belief that humanity could rebuild through cooperation rather than domination, and that even in a violent border zone overshadowed by tyrants, profiteers, and power brokers, compassion and knowledge remained forces worth defending at any cost. Freeside's water crisis stands as one of the most defining and destabilizing forces shaping the daily lives of its residents, a complex struggle born not only from the Mojave's naturally brutal aridity, but from political manipulation, economic imbalance, and the cruel arithmetic of scarcity that governs existence on the margins of New Vegas. For while the glittering towers of the Strip enjoy uninterrupted access to purified, abundant water sustained by Mr. House's advanced pre-war systems, the people outside those walls navigate a relentless fight for hydration that determines health, social order, and even survival. In the years following House's revival of the Strip, his tightly controlled infrastructure prioritized the casinos and luxury venues that formed the economic backbone of New Vegas. And though the water purification network beneath the city produced more than enough clean water to sustain the Strip's elite, House deliberately restricted wider access, ensuring that only those who contributed to his vision of a prosperous tourist haven benefited from its output. Consequently, Freeside, situated directly outside the Strip yet excluded from its resources, emerged as a paradoxical wasteland pocket where proximity to advanced water systems did nothing to alleviate suffering, leaving the population dependent on a combination of inconsistent sources: rationed water shipments delivered at the followers' expense, small-scale scavenging of functional pipes, NCR relief caravans when politics made them possible, and predatory vendors who capitalized on shortages by selling questionable water at inflated prices. This created a hierarchy of desperation where even a few extra caps often meant the difference between illness and stability, and where the distribution lines at the old Mormon fort became daily battlegrounds of exhaustion, hope, and anxiety as residents waited for small amounts of safe water that could be consumed without risk of contracting diseases from contaminated runoff or irradiated sources common throughout the Mojave. The followers of the apocalypse, especially under the pragmatic leadership of Julie Farkas, shouldered the impossible responsibility of regulating and distributing water to a constantly growing population, a task they approached through careful rationing, purification techniques, and cooperative agreements with sympathetic locals. But the sheer demand constantly overwhelmed their limited supplies. Their filtration equipment, already salvaged and fragile, was pushed to its limits, requiring constant maintenance performed under resource constraints that would make even the NCR's quartermasters balk. Worse still, the followers' strictly humanitarian approach, offering water freely to any who needed it, put them at repeated risk of exploitation, for smugglers and opportunists attempted to siphon or steal supplies to sell on the black market, turning water into yet another commodity traded by the desperate and the ruthless. Meanwhile, the NCR's sporadic relief efforts further complicated the crisis. NCR troopers and aid workers occasionally brought purified water into Freeside as part of broader attempts to curry favor with the civilian population, but these distributions were inconsistent, often driven by political agendas rather than humanitarian need, and their presence frequently provoked tension with the kings, who viewed such aid as manipulative interference rather than genuine assistance. In moments when NCR relief was delayed or withheld, whether due to rationing, supply chain issues, or shifting priorities, resentment surged among residents who felt abandoned by yet another potential protector, fostering an atmosphere of distrust that undermined Freeside's fragile social order. At the same time, rogue elements within Freeside capitalized on the chaos. Small gangs and independent enforcers occasionally attempted to control access to fountains or pipes that still produced usable water, extorting locals or charging tolls that forced many families into deeper poverty. This exploitation was enabled by Freeside's geography, narrow alleyways, collapsed storefronts, and derelict infrastructure created choke points where control could easily be asserted through simple brute force, and the kings, despite their efforts to maintain stability, could not patrol every corner nor prevent every act of predation. Thus, the water crisis became not merely a health emergency but a catalyst for conflict, forcing Freeside's residents into constant negotiation with the environment and with one another. Even when water was acquired, its quality was unpredictable. Some sources were laced with contaminants from decaying pipes, others carried trace radiation, and still others were so mineral-heavy that long-term consumption risked debilitating health complications, all of which placed an additional burden on the followers' medical staff, who treated cases of dehydration, infection, and chemical exposure on a near-daily basis, often working without sufficient supplies. The crisis also shaped Freeside's economy. Those with access to reliable water, no matter how meager, could trade it for food, clothing, or protection, creating microeconomies that both stabilized and stratified the district. Even small water merchants, whose practices were sometimes honest, sometimes exploitative, became influential actors in Freeside's social fabric. At a broader level, the crisis exemplified the fundamental inequality between the Strip and its surrounding communities. Inside the walls, fountains flowed endlessly, casino pools glistened beneath neon lights, and wealthy patrons consumed purified water without a second thought, while outside those same walls, mothers rationed sips for their children, street beggars begged not for caps but for a cup of hydration, and the followers begged Mr. House's robotic administrators for basic support that never came. House's refusal to divert resources to Freeside was, From his perspective, a rational calculation. He saw the district as a chaotic zone, best kept at arm's length, its suffering an unfortunate but necessary byproduct of his wider plan for a stable, profitable New Vegas. But for those living within Freeside's borders, his indifference transformed everyday hydration into an exhausting struggle that shaped identity and resilience. The water crisis ultimately became one of the core dynamics that defined Freeside's character, influencing alliances, fueling conflict, and highlighting the human capacity to endure, even when abandoned by wealth and power, hovering just beyond arm's reach. In this way, water in Freeside was never simply a resource, it was a symbol of inequality, a catalyst for social evolution, and an ever-present reminder that survival in the Mojave depended not only on strength or cunning, but on the fragile threads of compassion and cooperation woven by those determined to build a community in a place the world had chosen to forget. Freeside exists in a constant state of tension precisely because it stands at the threshold of Robert House's glittering masterpiece, and any examination of its struggles must begin with the policies enacted by the reclusive technocrat who revived New Vegas from its post-apocalyptic rubble and molded the Strip into a fortified oasis of profit and security, creating by design a sharp socio-economic boundary that placed Freeside on the outside looking in, a place simultaneously dependent on and excluded from the wealth of the city it adjoins. The root of this divide lies in House's selective reconstruction strategy, which focused almost entirely on the Strip proper and the casino families he resurrected to run it, leaving surrounding districts like Freeside, Westside, and North Vegas to fend for themselves without institutional investment, infrastructure, or governance, essentially turning them into buffer zones, protecting the Strip's controlled prosperity. And from the earliest days of House's post-war rule, Freeside's fate was determined by a simple calculation. It was too close to be ignored, but too unruly to be allowed inside, resulting in a policy framework that prioritized strict control at the gates, while leaving the day-to-day conditions of the neighborhood to evolve or deteriorate on their own. The Strip's primary concern was not the well-being of Freeside's residents, but the maintenance of a steady economic funnel, and House engineered this dynamic with precision, knowing the foot traffic of wastelanders hoping to gamble, trade, or seek opportunity on the Strip would, by necessity, pass through Freeside, turning it into an unofficial processing zone where potential customers, mercenaries, traders, and drifters accumulated, bringing with them a volatile mix of hope, desperation, and opportunism that shaped local commerce as much as it shaped crime. By enforcing a strict credit check at the Strip gates through the omnipresent Securitrons, House ensured that only individuals with caps, or something worth taking, could enter, a policy that had a profound economic consequence for Freeside because it meant that the destitute, the addicted, and the chronically unlucky were trapped outside its walls, unable to escape their circumstances and forming a permanent underclass whose presence fueled both petty crime and the black market economy. And although House had the capability to deploy Securitrons into Freeside to stabilize it, he deliberately refrained, allowing lawlessness to flourish as a deterrent to casual trespassers, and as an unspoken reminder that safety was a luxury reserved for those who could afford the Strip's protection, a strategy referencing House's core philosophy that stability must be purchased and that governance without economic contribution is a waste of resources, creating a scenario in which the Strip's prosperity relied on Freeside's chaos to highlight the contrast This relationship intensified as the Strip's casinos grew richer, attracting caravans, NCR troops on leave, wealthy travelers, mercenaries seeking work, and drifters hoping for a miracle, all of whom were forced to navigate Freeside before reaching their destinations. And the local residents adapted to this steady influx by developing a culture that balanced hospitality with exploitation. Where street vendors sold makeshift goods, hustlers and gamblers waited to prey on newcomers, and criminals targeted the inexperienced, a natural result of the Strip's neglect, but also a consequence of House's refusal to establish a functioning municipal structure beyond his own corporate domain, effectively ensuring Freeside's economy would be shaped from the bottom up rather than through top-down management. The followers of the apocalypse, who established their free clinic in the old Mormon fort, observed firsthand the human toll of this economic borderland, noting that the Strip's policies created a churn of human suffering that spilled into their halls. Gamblers who lost everything and couldn't get back in, individuals beaten by thugs who targeted those turned away from the gates, addicts who bought cut chems from dealers, thriving in an unregulated market, and malnourished families unable to afford reliable water rations from the heavily controlled supply lines, showing that House's tolerance for Freeside's instability was not mere indifference, but a strategic calculation that the neighborhood's dysfunction served as a filter that sorted the wealthy from the poor, the disciplined from the desperate, and the useful from the burdensome. In this way, the Strip's shadow was not just literal, but social, economic, and psychological, shaping how Freeside residents saw themselves and how they related to the greater entity of New Vegas, fostering resentment, envy, and a sense of exclusion that defined the community's identity. And no group felt this divide more acutely than the Kings, who adopted their ethos of independence, self-sufficiency, and community pride partly as a response to the Strip's indifference, seeing themselves as protectors of a population abandoned by the city that profited from their proximity but refused to acknowledge them as legitimate citizens. House's policies also influenced trade patterns within Freeside, particularly around the Atomic Wrangler, Mick and Ralph's, and the Silver Rush, businesses that thrived not because they were supported by Strip infrastructure, but because they served as alternatives for individuals who either could not or did not wish to engage with the Strip's monopolistic system, and these establishments benefited from the lack of regulation, allowing them to push vice, weaponry, and illicit services in ways that would never be tolerated under House's watch inside the walls of the Strip, cementing Freeside as a frontier of excess and experimentation where moral and legal boundaries were fluid. And in this environment, exploitation became normalized, not only by criminals, but by business owners who recognized that House's hands-off approach allowed them to operate with fewer restrictions so long as their activities didn't threaten the Strip's interests directly. Even the presence of NCR in the broader Mojave had limited impact on this dynamic, as House maintained strict control of the Strip and its entry points, preventing the NCR from establishing influence deeper into the city, and this further isolated Freeside, caught between two competing powers, one too controlling to let them in, the other too politically constrained to intervene meaningfully, resulting in a space where the rules of the wasteland prevailed despite being steps away from one of the most technologically advanced city-states in post-war America. Moreover, House's long-term plans for humanity, focused on technological advancement and controlled progress, did not prioritize uplifting communities like Freeside, which he saw as inevitable byproducts of post-war realities. populations that could not be fully integrated into his vision but remained necessary as reservoirs of labor, culture, and unpredictability, elements that contributed indirectly to the Strip's cultural image as a place of chance and opportunity against the backdrop of hardship and instability. But while House's policies created suffering, they also created a strange kind of resilience, as Freeside adapted to survive, forming its own power structures, trade networks, and social norms independent of the Strip's influence. And in that independence lies the central irony. House's attempt to ignore Freeside helped forge it into a distinct community, with identities, loyalties, and institutions of its own, from the king's role as informal police force to the followers' role as medical backbone, to the independent merchants who carve out livelihoods in the narrow streets, all shaped in opposition to a central authority that never intended to govern them. Thus, the Strip's shadow is not only a story of neglect but one of unintended consequence, where House's laser-focused pursuit of technological and economic revival created a ring of human struggle that simultaneously weakened and strengthened the city around it, creating a dynamic ecosystem in which Freeside exists as both a warning and a necessity, a contradictory space that fuels the Strip's myths while exposing its costs. And as long as House maintains his hold on New Vegas, Freeside will remain locked in this liminal state, a place shaped by forces that shine brightly above it, yet never reach down far enough to illuminate its streets. Daily life in Freeside is defined by constant negotiation with uncertainty, a daily struggle shaped by the neighborhood's lack of formal governance, the scarcity of essential resources, and the uneasy coexistence of competing factions. And anyone attempting to understand the rhythm of this run-down border district must look beyond the ruins, the graffiti, and the fractured pavement to see how its residents construct meaning and survival within an environment that offers little stability, a place where people awaken each morning not to promises of safety or prosperity, but to the unspoken knowledge that their future depends on improvisation, alliances, and the ability to read danger as easily as opportunity. The first sounds of Freeside each day come from the shouts of traders and the clatter of makeshift stalls being erected in the streets near the gates, where merchants compete fiercely for the attention of travelers passing toward the Strip, knowing that securing a few early sales can mean the difference between eating or going hungry. And these merchants, whether selling wasteland scrap, bootlegged chems, foraged food, or scavenged weapon parts, form the backbone of the local economy, operating without regulation, oversight, or protection, relying instead on reputation, intimidation, or alliances with groups like the Kings, or independent muscle for survival. Nearby, urchins and runaways awaken inside abandoned storefronts or collapsed motels, brushing dust from threadbare blankets, preparing to scatter into the streets before a gang, addict, or desperate adult tries to explode them. Their movements swift and cautious, learned through harsh experience, and these children, some orphaned by raiders, others by addiction, many simply forgotten, form an invisible but essential part of Freeside's daily life, performing odd jobs, running messages, scavenging recyclables for merchants, or sometimes slipping into pickpocket rings, where older youths teach them which travelers are easiest to target and how to escape retaliation, a hard education carved into the edges of survival. As mid-morning approaches, Freeside's central corridor grows increasingly crowded, with travelers from across the Mojave funneling through the district. NCR soldiers on leave and eager to gamble, Great Khan traders passing through with chem shipments, caravans heading toward Crimson Caravan or the Gunrunners, and countless individual wanderers hoping to reach the Strip, all converging in a chaotic flow that creates opportunity and danger alike. For where wealth moves, predators follow, and Freeside's lack of official law enforcement ensures that thieves, con artists, addicts desperate for caps, and freelance thugs circulate among the crowds with practiced ease, studying body language, baggage size, and the direction of someone's gaze to determine whether they are an easy mark. The kings patrol their territory intermittently, dressed in leather jackets, pompadours immaculate, their presence a calming influence in some areas, and a warning in others. For while they see themselves as protectors of Freeside's people, their control is informal and uneven, based on relationships, respect, and the implied threat of retaliation rather than codified rules or consistent oversight. And although their patrols discourage open violence near their school or the areas they consider core territory, the kings lack the manpower to control every alley, and the spaces outside their influence quickly slip into the grasp of gangs, addicts, or opportunists who impose their own improvised order. Meanwhile, the followers of the apocalypse begin their workday inside the old Mormon fort, rationing medical supplies, organizing treatment stations, and preparing for the inevitable influx of patients, gunshot victims, overdose cases, malnourished families, dehydrated wanderers, or individuals beaten during disputes. And the Followers' Clinic, one of the few stable support systems in Freeside, represents a fragile island of compassion surrounded by hardship, a place where residents gather not only for medical treatment but for the hope of guidance or stability, though even here resources are stretched thin due to constant demand and the inability to secure reliable funding or supplies in a district where commerce is chaotic and where humanitarian work is often undervalued. As the sun climbs high, the heat bakes the cracked pavement, and the neighborhood's deeper problems become increasingly apparent: lack of clean water, unreliable access to food, and the constant presence of addiction, all of which shape the atmosphere of the streets, where dehydrated residents wait anxiously at water stations, clutching ration vouchers tightly, knowing that disputes can quickly escalate into fights. Hen supplies run low, and where the sun-bleached walls are covered in graffiti testifying to the district's fractured identity, territory markers from gangs, stylized icons of the kings, and warnings scrawled by local residents attempting to deter would-be criminals, chem addicts drift through the streets in various stages of withdrawal or intoxication, some begging for caps, others offering stolen goods at suspiciously low prices, their behavior unpredictable and sometimes volatile, and their presence strains the community further, as merchants lock away goods behind makeshift barriers and families keep children indoors, hoping to avoid unpredictable confrontations. Yet in the midst of this instability, Freeside fosters an informal social structure built on necessity. Neighbors share knowledge of safe routes to travel, which merchants can be trusted, which alleys are controlled by gangs, and when it is best to avoid the area near the Silver Rush, where the Van Graffs' reputation for violence serves as its own grim deterrent. And this patchwork of shared awareness substitutes for the absence of official governance, shaping the survival strategies of both long-term residents and newcomers seeking to understand the unwritten rules that dictate movement and behavior. Commerce in Freeside extends far beyond legitimate trade, spilling into a spectrum of black market activity that thrives precisely because no authority exists to restrain it. And in backrooms hidden behind damaged storefronts, chem labs produce unregulated jet or mix scavenged ingredients into potent cocktails sold to addicts and wastelanders seeking escape, while arms dealers circulate weapons ranging from rusted pistols to energy cells of questionable origin. And such activity flourishes under the knowledge that the kings focus primarily on maintaining peace rather than eradicating commerce. After all, shutting down black market operations would create power vacuums that could ignite violence, so the kings, the followers, and many merchants begrudgingly tolerate these businesses as long as they maintain a minimal level of discretion. Beyond the streets and the storefronts, another layer of Freeside's daily life emerges in its interpersonal relationships, shaped by shared hardship and a sense of collective identity forged through adversity, where residents form loose-knit alliances to protect against threats, share food and information, and help each other navigate an environment that outsiders often view as irredeemably dangerous, yet locals see as home, a place where trust is difficult but not impossible, and where acts of quiet generosity occur just as frequently as acts of desperation, someone giving away a small portion of scavenged food, a merchant allowing a family to barter instead of pay outright, a king's member escorting a frightened child safely home, showing that resilience and cruelty intermingle constantly. In the late afternoon, Freeside's atmosphere grows tense as the combination of rising alcohol consumption, accumulated frustrations, and crowd density increases the likelihood of violent altercations, and it is during these hours that the kings often conduct their most active patrols, breaking up fights, warning troublemakers, or stepping in to prevent disputes between merchants, all while carefully avoiding escalation with more dangerous entities such as the Graffs, whose interests in the silver rush create an uneasy balance of terror within the district, as the energy weapons dealers operate under their own brutal code, deterring interference through lethal force, and ensuring that even the boldest criminals give their storefront a wide berth. Nighttime transforms Freeside entirely, replacing the dusty chaos of day with an atmosphere of heightened danger, where dim lamplight and flickering neon cast long shadows across narrow alleys, and where the sound of muffled gunshots or frantic footsteps echoes through the ruins with unsettling regularity, compelling residents to stay indoors, behind barricaded doors whenever possible, and those forced to roam the streets, merchants returning from late sales, addicts searching for a fix, or scavengers hoping to find discarded valuables near the strip's gates, must move carefully, avoiding known hotspots or traveling in small groups to deter ambushes, while high above them the bright lights of the strip glow like a taunt, illuminating the sky with wealth and security that most Freeside residents will never experience. Yet even under these conditions, commerce does not entirely cease, as certain backroom establishments cater to night clientele, offering gambling, prostitution, or illicit substances in cramped rooms, illuminated by flickering candles or jury-rigged lights. And here deals are made quiet, alliances are forged or broken, and individuals from various factions, kings, independent thugs, desperate residents, interact in uneasy coexistence, united by the shared understanding that nighttime transactions are inherently risky, but too profitable to ignore. The followers remain awake within the old Mormon fort long after sunset, their lamps burning through the night as they treat victims of violence or overdose who are carried or dragged to their doorstep. And though the followers have neither the manpower nor the equipment to act as a true medical infrastructure for the entire neighborhood, they shoulder the burden as best they can, their compassionate presence serving as Freeside's closest equivalent to a public service. Despite the dangers and hardships, Freeside maintains a distinctive identity shaped by a culture of resilience, improvisation, and community interdependence, where people carve out normalcy in abnormal circumstances, sharing stories, maintaining small gardens behind ruins, repairing clothing by lantern light, teaching children basic literacy or barter skills, and forming micro-communities for protection and companionship, all of which demonstrate that even in a lawless quarter, humanity persists through acts of creation and solidarity. Ultimately, daily life in Freeside is defined by contradiction, a place of danger yet also of community, of exploitation yet also mutual support, of chaos yet also patterned routines that give structure to the lives of its inhabitants, and these contradictions shape the district into a harsh but living organism, whose survival depends on the careful balance between the forces of crime, commerce, poverty, and the informal governance of those who care enough, or are powerful enough, to shape it, ensuring that Freeside, despite its struggles, continues to endure in the shadow of the glimmering strip. The Atomic Wrangler stands as one of Freeside's most defining institutions because it embodies the district's harsh economic realities, unapologetic vices, and the precarious balance of power that emerges in a community without centralized regulation, and its rise to prominence under the Garrett twins, Francine and James, illustrates how ambition, ruthlessness, and opportunism can carve out a sphere of influence even in a place as chaotic as Freeside, where profit is often inseparable from exploitation and survival is measured in chips, caps, or the ability to enforce a debt. Housed in a patched-together building along the main northern corridor, the Wrangler operates not merely as a casino but as a multifunctional vice hub that provides gambling, liquor, chems, prostitutes, and mercenary work all under one roof, a business model that thrives precisely because the Garretts understand Freeside's needs and weaknesses better than almost anyone, leveraging the fact that the strip's credit checks shut out impoverished travelers and locals alike, funneling them into cheaper alternatives where the rules are flexible and the stakes, though lower, come with very real physical consequences. The Garrett twins are pragmatic to the core, shaped by an upbringing in a region where desperation is the defining currency, and they view their clientele not through the lens of morality, but through calculations of risk, reward, and liability, an approach reflected in their willingness to extend credit to gamblers who cannot afford to lose, to hire mercenaries for violent collections, and to maintain a stable of sex workers whose well-being is secondary to their profitability, illustrated most prominently in their relationship with the ghoul sex worker Beatrix Russell, and the more tragic cases, like the debt-ensnared prostitute, simply known as Dixon's victims, individuals caught in the destructive cycle of addiction promoted by suppliers who operate in tandem with the Wranglers' economic interests. The Wranglers' gambling halls, dimly lit and reeking of smoke and stale drink, buzz with a mixture of excitement and dread as players sit at battered tables, rolling dice or spinning wheels in games designed to extract every last cap, with the Garretts ensuring that odds are just fair enough to keep customers returning, but skewed enough to maintain a steady house advantage. And this steady flow of caps is protected by James Garrett's skill in managing the books and Francine's notorious temper, which serves as a deterrent against both cheating and attempts to shirk debts. Outside the public eye, the Wranglers' back rooms reveal the harsher side of their operations, records meticulously tracking who owes money, who is overdue, and who requires encouragement, with enforcement often delegated to hired thugs who patrol Freeside's violence-ridden streets with orders to break fingers, bloody noses, or drag defaulters back for more serious consequences, representing one of the few structured, albeit brutal, systems of accountability in a district where official law does not exist. The Garretts' influence extends beyond the casino itself through a network of informal partnerships and exploitative arrangements. They maintain deals with chem suppliers like Dixon, whose cut jet and cheap alcohol keep residents trapped in cycles of addiction that drive them back to the Wranglers' gambling tables in search of enough caps to buy their next fix, creating a destructive loop that benefits both Dixon and the Garretts, while overwhelming the followers of the apocalypse with patients suffering from withdrawal or chemical poisoning, demonstrating how the economics of vice ripple outward into Freeside's broader social fabric. Prostitution, another cornerstone of Wrangler business, is handled with similar ruthlessness. Framed by the Garretts as a necessary service for travelers and locals alike, though in practice it often reflects the desperate economic conditions of Freeside, drawing in individuals who have few other options and frequently falling victim to exploitation, debt bondage, or violent customers. This system is epitomized by the Garretts' treatment of their workers, many of whom endure poor working conditions, harassment, or debt manipulation. And while the courier's intervention can improve the situation by helping the Garretts recruit more ethically or by negotiating better deals for workers like Beatrix, the underlying profit-driven structure remains unchanged, revealing that even positive reforms rely on the leverage of outside influence rather than shifting values among the Garretts. In addition to vice, the Wrangler is a major employer in Freeside, providing jobs to bartenders, dealers, guards, entertainers, and prostitutes. And while the positions offer some stability compared to the unpredictability of street survival, employees remain vulnerable to both internal pressures, such as strict quotas, unforgiving debt policies, and dangerous clientele, and external ones, like the constant threat of violence from gangs or individuals angered by perceived slights, demonstrating how employment in Freeside is always entangled with danger. The Garretts themselves maintain a delicate balance with other power players in the neighborhood. They avoid antagonizing the Kings directly, understanding that open hostilities with Freeside's most respected faction would threaten their business. Yet their practices occasionally draw criticism or intervention from the followers, who view the Wrangler as a source of much of the community's suffering, though the followers' lack of political or military leverage limits their ability to oppose the Garretts in any meaningful way. The Van Graffs, situated only a short walk away at the Silver Rush, maintain a cold but stable coexistence with the Wrangler, each recognizing that conflict between their businesses would destabilize Freeside and damage profits on both sides. And while the Van Graffs operate with greater violence and far more lethal products, both factions share an implicit understanding that control of their respective markets is best maintained through mutual avoidance rather than competition. The Wrangler's economic reach also influences travelers and caravan routes, as those unable to afford entry to the Strip often linger in Freeside long enough to spend caps at the casino, feed addictions, or fall into debt. And this constant influx of transient customers ensures a steady revenue stream for the Garretts, making the Wrangler a vital component of Freeside's border economy, where every visitor is seen as either a potential profit or a potential problem to be neutralized. The courier's arrival represents a rare moment when the Garretts are forced to adapt their operations, as the courier may help them find new high-quality workers, solve the chronic problem of a missing sex robot, or negotiate settlements between disgruntled employees and the twins. And, depending on how the courier handles these tasks, the wrangler may become slightly more ethical or even more successful in exploiting its clientele, demonstrating how external intervention can shift but not fundamentally transform Freeside's economic realities. For all its brutality, the atomic wrangler occupies a paradoxical place in Freeside's life. It is a source of employment, entertainment, and relative stability, yet it perpetuates addiction, debt, and exploitation, shaping the neighborhood's identity as much through its vices as through the limited structure it provides, operating as one of the closest things Freeside has to an institution with rules, even if those rules serve primarily to enrich the Garretts. Ultimately, the Atomic Wrangler is a reflection of Freeside itself. Harsh, opportunistic, unregulated, and shaped by the constant negotiation between desperation and ambition, where survival often depends on one's ability to navigate a world in which every vice is available, every deal carries hidden dangers, and every cap extracted from a gambler, drinker, or addict helps the Garrett twins maintain their grip on one of the Mojave's most morally ambiguous enterprises, ensuring that as long as Freeside remains a place of poverty and power vacuums, the Wrangler will continue to thrive, feeding on the hopes, failures, and addictions of those who pass through its doors. The streets of Freeside tell countless stories of survival, but perhaps none are as haunting or as overlooked as those of the children who inhabit its alleys, derelict buildings, and makeshift shelters. For while the Mojave's violence, scarcity, and neglect dominate the narrative of the adult population, it is the youth, orphans, runaways, and those born into this borderland that bear the weight of a society that has left them largely to fend for themselves, their daily existence shaped not only by hunger, thirst, and exposure, but by the necessity of navigating complex social and criminal hierarchies that adults spend years learning to manage, a stark reality that forces children to mature prematurely and often violently. These young residents are drawn to Freeside by circumstance and proximity. Children whose parents died during NCR skirmishes, raider attacks, or chem overdoses, as well as those abandoned or forcibly removed from family units by poverty or addiction, congregate in the ruins of pre-war buildings, in the shadows of the Strip's neon glow, and near the patrol routes of the Kings, who provide a partial measure of protection while simultaneously shaping the children's understanding of power, respect, and territorial boundaries. The Kings, led by their charismatic leader, offer mentorship in some cases, teaching young people basic survival skills, the unwritten rules of the streets, and the rudiments of loyalty and cooperation. But this guidance is filtered through the lens of gang-like organization, meaning that children learn both discipline and intimidation, understanding early that allegiance to a faction can be the difference between life and death, while the followers of the apocalypse serve as the moral and practical counterweight, offering education, medical care, literacy, and basic hygiene training. Yet their reach is limited by resources, and many children grow up receiving only sporadic lessons or half-comprehended guidance, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. These young residents adopt roles within Freeside's informal economy almost immediately. They become messengers, pickpockets, scavengers, or apprentices to chem dealers, their small size and relative invisibility granting them access to tasks too risky for adults, while others serve as eyes and ears for the Kings, or rival factions, reporting movements, potential threats, or opportunities for expansion, and in doing so, they gain practical experience in strategy, negotiation, and deception far earlier than children in a structured society, though this knowledge comes at the cost of innocence, as every interaction reinforces the harsh realities of survival in a lawless zone. Freeside's children also navigate a complex social hierarchy among themselves, forming informal gangs or friendship groups based on trust, shared experiences, and mutual protection, often occupying abandoned buildings or hidden corners of the district, learning the Mojave's geography more thoroughly than most adults, and developing cultural markers that distinguish insiders from outsiders, such as local slang, graffiti tags, and improvised rituals, all of which contribute to a sense of identity in a place where official recognition or societal validation is absent, and where survival itself is a continuous education in adaptability. Exposure to chem culture is nearly universal, as the district's ongoing addiction crisis touches every segment of the population, and children are not exempt. Many witness or even participate in the handling, distribution, or consumption of jet, psycho, or other stimulants, sometimes out of necessity to cope with hunger, fear, or trauma, or as a means of gaining favor with older figures who control resources, which fosters cycles of dependency and perpetuates the very systems of exploitation the followers attempt to mitigate, highlighting the delicate balance between protection and exposure that defines youth in Freeside. Schooling, if it exists at all, is fragmented, with the followers providing the most structured educational efforts, offering lessons in literacy, arithmetic, basic science, and ethics, though these classes are subject to frequent interruptions from raids, chem-related emergencies, or the sheer necessity of securing water and food, and children often attend inconsistently, with many missing months or years due to illness, violence, or the need to work for survival, resulting in a patchwork of knowledge that is incomplete but pragmatically sufficient to navigate the Mojave's challenges. Psychological trauma is widespread, as children witness extreme violence, the death of family members, and the arbitrary cruelty of both adults and the environment, leading to adaptive behaviors that can include aggression, hypervigilance, or detachment. And while some display remarkable resilience and ingenuity, others develop long-term mental health issues exacerbated by the lack of formal care, creating a generational cohort uniquely attuned to survival yet profoundly marked by the harsh realities of life in a neglected border zone. Despite the dangers, Freeside's children exhibit forms of play, imagination, and creativity that endure even in adversity, constructing makeshift games, storytelling traditions, and secret meeting places that allow them brief reprieves from the pressures of survival, reflecting the human drive for community and culture even under extreme conditions. And these acts of resilience often serve as the foundation for future leaders, informants, or community organizers who carry the lessons of their youth into adulthood. The district's informal economy also relies on these children for communication networks, intelligence gathering, and labor, a reality that both empowers them and exposes them to risk, creating a paradox in which dependence fosters agency, but also perpetuates vulnerability. Interactions with outsiders such as the courier can dramatically alter the trajectories of individual youths, providing opportunities for mentorship, access to resources, or protection that can shift their immediate survival odds or longer-term prospects. Though such interventions rarely affect systemic conditions, leaving the broader population of children subject to the ongoing forces of poverty, violence, and neglect. Ultimately, Freeside's children embody the intersection of systemic failure and human resilience, serving as both victims and active participants in the district's survival, their lives shaped by the interplay of adult factions, environmental scarcity, and the moral choices, or indifference, of those around them. And their presence underscores the enduring human capacity to adapt, resist, and construct meaning even in a place where society's traditional structures have largely collapsed, highlighting the complex social, psychological, and economic mechanisms that define Freeside not merely as a geographic location, but as a crucible in which the youngest members of the Mojave are forged into a generation capable of surviving, and in some cases thriving, amid chaos. The uneasy coexistence of the Kings and the new California Republic in the Mojave wasteland represents one of the most persistent sources of tension in Freeside, a conflict defined by competing visions of governance, identity, and the very definition of freedom in a region caught between authoritarian order and localized self-determination. For the Kings, led by the charismatic and ideologically driven king, view themselves as the rightful stewards of Freeside, enforcing their own informal but strict codes of conduct to maintain order among a population largely ignored by the centralized structures of the Strip and the NCR, whereas the new California Republic, expanding into the Mojave with its promises of law, taxation, and infrastructure, interprets Freeside as both strategically vital and socially chaotic, a place in need of assimilation into its bureaucratic framework in order to secure resources, trade routes, and political legitimacy, creating a fundamental tension between local autonomy and external authority that manifests in both open conflict and subtle maneuvering. From the earliest NCR patrols into the area, the Kings recognized the Republic's presence as a direct threat not only to their territorial control, but to their social influence. For NCR soldiers and bureaucrats, operating with an ethos of institutional superiority, frequently assumed that Freeside residents should be treated as subjects rather than stakeholders, enforcing regulations, collecting taxes, and asserting the Republic's vision of justice without considering the existing systems of informal governance and social reciprocity the Kings had cultivated. And these interventions often provoked friction, especially when they undermined the authority of local leaders or disrupted delicate balances of power in the streets. The Kings' response to NCR encroachment was characterized by a mixture of pragmatism and defiance. While they understood the military superiority of the Republic and often sought to avoid direct confrontation, they also engaged in symbolic acts of resistance, asserting their cultural identity through visible markers such as the maintenance of pompadours, leather jackets, and territorial graffiti, as well as through public displays of authority, organized patrols, and selective enforcement of justice that emphasized community protection over compliance with external law, thereby reinforcing the distinction between Freeside's internal governance and NCR bureaucratic expectations. In practice, this tension manifested in several ways. Checkpoints at key intersections became sites of negotiation and occasional standoffs. King's patrols monitored NCR movement through their streets to prevent exploitation of residents, and both sides engaged in intelligence gathering and rumor networks to anticipate each other's actions, a cat-and-mouse dynamic that reflected both strategic calculation and deep mutual mistrust. Economic factors further intensified these tensions, as Freeside's informal markets, gambling halls, and chem distribution networks operated outside NCR control, depriving the Republic of both taxation revenue and the ability to regulate commerce according to its legal codes, while simultaneously giving the kings leverage over local trade and influence among residents. Attempts by the NCR to introduce official law enforcement or social programs were often viewed by the kings as intrusive and condescending, with the Republic's bureaucrats failing to appreciate the nuanced social contracts that allowed Freeside to function in the absence of formal governance, while residents themselves were forced to navigate overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting authority claims, balancing compliance with the NCR against loyalty to the kings in order to secure personal safety, access to goods, and social stability. Cultural identity played a central role in this struggle, as the kings emphasized the preservation of Freeside's traditions, rituals, and social cohesion as a counterpoint to the NCR's homogenizing influence, promoting pride, solidarity, and territorial respect among local youth, while the NCR promoted civic assimilation, loyalty oaths, and the adoption of external standards of justice and civic responsibility, framing the conflict not only in practical terms of control, but also as a clash of values: local autonomy versus institutional conformity, street-enforced law versus bureaucratic regulation, and adaptive morality versus codified justice. Violence was both a symptom and a tool within this tension, with skirmishes and targeted raids occurring sporadically as the kings defended their perceived rights against what they saw as overreach, while NCR patrols demonstrated the Republic's willingness to project power into contested zones, though neither side sought all-out war, understanding that sustained conflict would disrupt commerce, endanger civilians, and potentially destabilize the region, leaving Freeside vulnerable to other opportunistic actors, such as independent gangs or mercenary groups, who exploited moments of weakness to assert temporary control, and thereby complicating an already tense balance of authority. Negotiation and pragmatism were also central to the relationship, with informal agreements, temporary truces, and personal connections between kings and sympathetic NCR personnel forming a fragile web of diplomacy that maintained relative order without formal treaties, allowing both sides to pursue overlapping interests: protection of trade routes, maintenance of access to critical water sources, and the prevention of uncontrolled violence, while still asserting ideological dominance in their respective spheres, demonstrating that Freeside's survival depended on the continuous, careful management of conflict as much as on its own informal governance structures. The arrival of influential outsiders, including merchants, chem dealers, and the enigmatic courier, further complicated this dynamic, as both the kings and the NCR sought to influence these actors, harnessing their resources, intelligence, and allegiances to reinforce control, with the outcome of these interventions often shifting the balance of power temporarily, yet never fully resolving the underlying struggle between centralized authority and local identity. In this environment, Freeside's residents became both participants and observers in an ongoing negotiation over their own autonomy, learning to navigate the competing expectations, threats, and protections offered by the kings and the NCR alike, internalizing the lessons of resilience, adaptability, and strategic alignment from an early age, while simultaneously fostering a strong sense of local identity, cultural pride, and territorial loyalty that has allowed Freeside to persist despite repeated pressures from external powers. Ultimately, the tension between the kings and the NCR illustrates the broader challenges of post-apocalyptic governance, highlighting the difficulties of imposing structured authority in a space shaped by history, geography, and social networks, and demonstrating that power in Freeside is not only exercised through force, but through reputation, culture, negotiation, and the continuous assertion of local values in the face of expansive, bureaucratic structures seeking to remake the district in their own image, a struggle that continues to define Freeside's character, resilience, and precarious autonomy. The Silver Rush, perched on the northern edge of Freeside, serves as both a symbol and a mechanism of power, representing the intersection of commerce, violence, and technological dominance in a society where formal governance is largely absent, and its proprietors, the Van Graff family, wield influence that extends far beyond the walls of their glittering, energy-laden emporium, shaping Freeside's economy, social structure, and even the conduct of rival factions through their control of energy weapons and their merciless enforcement of debt, obligation, and hierarchy. This family-run business began as a salvage and refurbishment operation for pre-war energy weaponry, evolving into the Mojave's most formidable purveyor of laser rifles, plasma pistols, and power armor energy modules, leveraging technological scarcity to create an unparalleled monopoly, with every transaction carefully calibrated to maximize profit while reinforcing social dominance. For the Van Graffs understood that in a region defined by violence and lawlessness, control over advanced weapons was synonymous with control over people, territory, and economic flow, giving them leverage over both local residents and itinerant mercenaries, and establishing an informal aristocracy within Freeside, whose authority rested on fear, respect, and the ever-present threat of lethality. Operating under the calculated ruthlessness of their matriarch, Christine Van Graff, the Silver Rush is fortified with both human and mechanical enforcers, including hired muscle, armed guards, and automated security measures that ensure trespassers or thieves pay immediate and often brutal consequences, and their willingness to enforce debts with swift violence has cemented the family's reputation as both indispensable and terrifying, meaning that even rival gangs, the Kings, and freelance adventurers approach the premises with extreme caution, fully aware that transgressions, whether over a disputed credit, stolen components, or disrespectful behavior, can escalate into permanent injury or death, a system that paradoxically stabilizes the surrounding community by reducing arbitrary chaos through the imposition of mercantile terror. Economically, the Silver Rush represents a keystone institution within Freeside's outer Vegas ecosystem, where residents, mercenaries, and visiting traders must interact with the Van Graffs not only to purchase weapons and ammunition, but also to access energy weapon, repair, parts, and technical expertise that cannot be found elsewhere, creating a dependency that reinforces the family's power and enables them to dictate prices, credit terms, and conditions of engagement in a district otherwise devoid of regulatory oversight. With even nominal agreements enforced through intimidation, alliances with enforcers, or carefully orchestrated displays of force, this economic dominance allows the Van Graffs to influence Freeside's broader market, determining who can arm themselves and who remains vulnerable, thereby indirectly shaping the outcomes of conflicts between factions. The behavior of itinerant gun-for-hire groups and the strategic calculations of the Kings NCR patrols, and independent raiders, embedding the Silver Rush deeply into the district's political and social calculus. For possession of energy weapons transforms ordinary residents into capable defenders or enforcers, and the Van Graffs' selective distribution of these tools grants them leverage over power dynamics across Freeside. The family's mercantile tyranny is underscored by the strict code of behavior enforced within the store, where both employees and customers are monitored, audited, and reminded constantly that obedience and respect are mandatory, and where failure to meet contractual obligations, whether repayment of loans, theft, or public disrespect, triggers swift repercussions, ranging from denial of service to brutal physical punishment, creating a climate of fear that simultaneously protects inventory and ensures compliance, and which extends beyond the store itself into Freeside's streets, as the Van Graffs' reputation functions as a deterrent to would-be challengers, establishing the Silver Rush not only as a business, but as an instrument of psychological control. This climate of control also affects the local economy by shaping behavior among smaller merchants, the kings, and itinerant operators, as all actors understand that energy weapons from the Silver Rush are essential tools for survival and leverage, and no serious faction can ignore the Van Graffs' influence without courting disaster. Disputes over energy weapon parts or failed contracts often escalate into armed confrontations, reinforcing the notion that the Silver Rush is both a provider and enforcer, mediating conflict through a mixture of intimidation, monopoly, and selective generosity, while the omnipresent threat of violence deters open rebellion or theft, consolidating the Van Graffs' authority as the uncontested power in the energy weapons market. The family also interacts strategically with outsiders, including the courier, recognizing the potential value of alliances or manipulation to advance profit and influence, offering high-value items or services contingent on loyalty, completion of specific tasks, or exploitation of competitors, a system that exemplifies their adaptive transactional approach to power. Relationships are conditional. Loyalty is rewarded but never assumed, and failure is punished without hesitation, reinforcing the environment of high stakes that defines Freeside's survival economy. Beyond economics, the Silver Rush also exerts subtle social influence, as access to energy weapons confers status, capability, and mobility within the district, enabling certain residents to rise within factional hierarchies, enforce local laws informally, or assert autonomy over otherwise contested territory, and this empowerment is tightly regulated by the Van Graffs, ensuring that those who gain advantage do so at the family's discretion, preventing the emergence of rival power centers that could threaten their monopoly. Violence, both potential and executed, is central to the Silver Rush's function, as public enforcement of debts and discipline demonstrates the consequences of defiance, while also signaling to every faction, kings, NCR, raiders, or independent operators, that the Van Graffs' control is absolute in their sphere, and that any challenge carries severe risk, a system that paradoxically stabilizes Freeside by reducing uncontrolled chaos, even as it maintains a constant undercurrent of fear. At the same time, the Silver Rush interacts indirectly with addiction and vice economies, as energy weapons supplied to chemrunners, mercenaries, and opportunists enable enforcement, theft, or protection in transactional networks that sustain the district's informal economy, linking the Van Graffs' mercantile reach to the broader cycles of exploitation, survival, and coercion that define Freeside life. and ensuring that their influence is both economic and socio-political, a duality that positions the Silver Rush as a cornerstone of power within an otherwise fragmented and lawless district. Ultimately, the Van Graffs' dominance exemplifies the interdependence of technology, violence, and commerce in post-war society, demonstrating that survival in Freeside depends not only on skill, courage, and cunning, but on access to tools and relationships controlled by those willing to enforce order through fear, and that the district's ongoing stability, economy, and social hierarchy are inextricably bound to the energy weapons monopoly wielded by a single family, whose presence guarantees both the means of empowerment and the ever-present threat of destruction, a paradox at the core of Freeside's enduring struggle to exist on the fringes of New Vegas civilization. Freeside's streets are not merely defined by poverty and lawlessness. They are also a landscape dominated by the pervasive presence of chem culture, a multi-layered economy of addiction that affects nearly every resident and traveler passing through, intertwining social, economic, and medical consequences in ways that shape the district's identity, governance, and daily survival. For in this borderland outside the Strip, chem use has evolved into both a symptom of scarcity and a tool of control, enabling dealers, fixers, and criminal enterprises to exert influence over individuals and communities while simultaneously draining the limited resources of humanitarian organizations like the Followers of the Apocalypse, whose clinics struggle to treat withdrawal, overdose, and long-term health consequences amidst an environment that often perpetuates the problem. The most notorious chem in Freeside is jet, a potent and highly addictive stimulant produced locally by hidden labs run by operators like Dixon, whose facilities manufacture the substance from scavenged ingredients and pre-war technology, creating a high-risk, high-reward trade that fuels crime, debt, and dependence, as those seeking relief, excitement, or escape fall into cycles of consumption that frequently render them unable to maintain steady work, guard themselves against violence, or provide for their families, thereby ensuring a constant pool of vulnerable individuals upon whom dealers and fixers can profit. Chem distribution networks in Freeside operate both openly and covertly, with street-level dealers hawking drugs near gambling halls, bars, and back alleys, while more organized operations move bulk shipments through the district, often involving mercenaries, couriers, and intermediaries who navigate the fractured power structures between the Kings, the Van Graffs, and independent operators, producing a shadow economy that rivals or even surpasses legitimate trade in value, influence, and impact on residents' daily lives. Addiction creates both dependency and social hierarchy. Addicts often fall under the sway of powerful figures, forced to work as couriers, debt enforcers, or street informants to sustain their supply, while chem labs and drug rings cultivate loyalty and fear through selective enforcement of rules, punishment for missed debts, or the threat of withdrawal without access to product, a dynamic that consolidates power in the hands of a few while marginalizing the majority of the population. And it is this imbalance that perpetuates Freeside's instability, even as it ensures continuous commerce. The presence of chems also directly burdens the Followers of the Apocalypse, who operate the free clinic in the old Mormon fort as a crucial support system for residents. Their staff confronts constant influxes of patients suffering from chemical poisoning, severe withdrawal symptoms, and injuries related to conflicts fueled by addiction, forcing them to ration supplies, prioritize treatment, and operate under conditions of persistent scarcity. And while they strive to provide education and rehabilitation, the scale of the problem, exacerbated by ongoing production and distribution, ensures that the clinic is perpetually overextended, its humanitarian mission continually challenged by the very social structures that chem culture has created. Socially, chem use impacts nearly every interaction in Freeside. Children encounter addicted adults as caregivers or neighbors. Gangs incorporate chems into initiation rituals or reward systems. Merchants factor the presence of addicted clients into pricing and credit decisions. And factions like the Kings must negotiate the influence of fixers and chem dealers to maintain territorial control without provoking uncontrollable violence, illustrating how addiction permeates every layer of the community, shaping behavior, alliances, and the distribution of power. Addiction is further complicated by its visibility. Public use of chems in alleyways, gambling dens, and bars creates both a spectacle and a warning, reinforcing the social hierarchy, signaling the influence of suppliers, and demonstrating the consequences of dependence, while clandestine laboratories continue production under the radar of formal authority, highlighting the difficulty of regulating a product that is simultaneously necessary, desired, and destructive. The courier's arrival in Freeside often intersects with this ecosystem, offering the potential to disrupt distribution, eliminate or assist specific chem operators, and influence the outcomes for both users and suppliers, demonstrating how a single external actor can temporarily shift balances of power, alleviate some suffering, or exacerbate dependency cycles, though the structural challenges, poverty, scarcity, and lack of formal law, remain constant, ensuring that the systemic presence of chem culture persists regardless of short-term interventions. Ultimately, Freeside's addiction crisis represents a microcosm of post-war societal collapse in which scarcity, opportunity, and human vulnerability converge to produce cycles of dependence that shape social behavior, economic flow, and factional power, demonstrating that the Mojave's chemical underworld is not merely a problem of individual weakness, but a structural feature of survival, an unavoidable factor in daily life, and a defining characteristic of a community negotiating existence at the boundary of civilization, opportunity, and exploitation, with consequences that ripple through families, neighborhoods, and institutions, leaving no resident untouched by the shadow of addiction. Freeside's identity as a liminal space, an area perched between the lawless expanse of the Mojave and the structured opulence of the New Vegas Strip, is fundamentally defined by the presence and influence of Mr. House's Securitrons, autonomous and semi-autonomous robotic enforcers whose deployment at the Strip's gates represents both technological control and psychological assertion, creating a clear boundary between the concentrated wealth, order, and resources of the Strip and the precarious, chaotic existence of Freeside, and shaping every interaction between residents, visitors, and factions in the border district. For while the Strip's glimmering facades symbolize opportunity and safety, the Securitrons make clear that access is conditional, regulated, and monitored, transforming Freeside into a zone where freedom is real but constrained, autonomy is relative, and power is constantly reinforced by mechanical surveillance. These robotic sentinels operate according to precise protocols programmed by House, enforcing strict rules regarding entry, identification, and behavior, and though they rarely patrol deep into Freeside itself, Their visibility at key choke points, such as the main entrance from Freeside into the Strip, or the secondary passageways leading to casinos and merchant districts, exerts a profound influence on the movement of people, commodities, and information, effectively regulating the flow of capital, labor, and illicit goods, while simultaneously serving as a constant reminder that Freeside exists in a subordinate, surveilled position relative to the Strip, a message reinforced not only by the robot's presence, but by the occasional use of force against those who violate access rules. The Securitron's operational logic intertwines with the political and economic ambitions of the Strip's administration, ensuring that Freeside residents, whether kings, independent merchants, or chem dealers, must calibrate their behavior to avoid confrontation, plan transactions carefully, and navigate the border between autonomy and intrusion, as minor infractions can escalate into violent interventions, arrests, or the denial of passage, and this system of mechanized regulation simultaneously stabilizes the boundary while asserting the Strip's dominance over Freeside, illustrating the broader interplay between technology, power, and social control in a post-war society. Beyond enforcement, the presence of the Securitrons affects economic behavior. Caravan operators, traders, and local merchants must account for the robot's programmed preferences, such as permitting passage for legitimate travelers, rejecting unauthorized commerce, and regulating contraband movement, a dynamic that shapes pricing, credit availability, and the selection of trade partners, as access to the Strip's wealth and supplies is contingent upon compliance, favoring those with the resources, knowledge, or connections to negotiate entry, while marginalizing others, further reinforcing Freeside's economic dependency on controlled access. This control also influences factional dynamics within Freeside, as the kings, the followers of the apocalypse, and independent operators all adjust their strategies in response to Securitron enforcement, understanding that overt conflict near the gates risks lethal confrontation or the disruption of commerce, and that the strategic manipulation of movement and influence, whether through intermediaries, diplomacy, or avoidance, becomes a core survival skill, a mechanism that turns the border into both a choke point and a stage for power negotiation. The psychological impact of Securitron presence cannot be understated. Their impassive, metallic frames, integrated weaponry, and unerring adherence to House's directives create an omnipresent sense of observation and potential reprisal, conditioning residents and travelers to self-regulate, minimize attention, and negotiate carefully for access, a behavioral modification that complements physical enforcement and ensures that Freeside's autonomy is exercised in constant awareness of superior external authority, producing a culture of caution, adaptation, and tactical awareness. Furthermore, the Securitron's interaction with Freeside is selective, with most mechanized enforcement concentrated at the threshold rather than in the district's interior, creating a de facto safe zone for local activity while maintaining a sharp distinction between inside and outside, liberty and restriction, freedom and oversight, a configuration that has profound consequences for migration, commerce, and social cohesion, as residents develop strategies to maximize opportunity while minimizing exposure to mechanical authority. Technological power also extends to coercion, as the threat of Securitron intervention is sufficient to deter disputes that might otherwise escalate into open conflict near the Strip, giving Mr. House a measure of indirect control over Freeside without requiring constant physical presence, and allowing factions like the Kings and the Graffs to operate within their own spheres with calculated risk, constrained but not entirely dominated by the external authority of the Strip. The courier's arrival in this context can further complicate access dynamics, as interactions with Securitrons through hacking, persuasion, or completion of missions on House's behalf demonstrate the potential for individual actors to influence the enforcement apparatus, temporarily reshaping power relations and mobility in Freeside, though the overarching system of robotic oversight remains intact, a constant structural feature that conditions social and economic behavior across the district. Ultimately, the Securitrons at the Strip's gates exemplify the intersection of technology, authority, and social engineering, illustrating how control over movement, access, and enforcement mechanisms can shape the identity, economy, and behavior of a neighboring lawless quarter, and how mechanized power, combined with centralized vision, can project influence without direct occupation, ensuring that Freeside exists perpetually in the shadow of the Strip's order, constantly negotiating autonomy, survival, and opportunity under the ever-watchful gaze of robotic enforcers. The arrival of the courier in Freeside represents a critical juncture in the district's precarious ecosystem, as this outsider, whose skills, choices, and allegiances are largely unpredictable, has the capacity to tip balances, reshape alliances, and alter the flow of commerce, power, and influence across both the neighborhood and the surrounding Mojave. For Freeside exists not as an isolated entity, but as a dynamic interface between competing factions, scarce resources, and human desperation. And the courier, by virtue of mobility, tactical knowledge, and access to advanced technology, becomes an active participant in that system rather than a passive observer, affecting outcomes in ways that reverberate through the social, economic, and political structures of the district. From the moment the courier steps into Freeside, their presence is noted by the Kings, the Graffs, the followers of the Apocalypse, and independent operators alike, each recognizing that the newcomer could either disrupt or stabilize existing arrangements depending on the choices made, the favors granted, and the information shared, and the courier's actions, ranging from resolving conflicts, delivering critical supplies, eliminating or assisting key figures, or arbitrating disputes, can produce immediate material effects, such as the redistribution of wealth, access to weaponry, or stabilization of gang territories, while simultaneously producing longer-term consequences by influencing factional trust, local morale, and the willingness of residents to cooperate with or resist authority. The courier's influence is amplified by the unique position they occupy as a neutral yet capable agent. They are neither formally bound by Freeside's local codes nor constrained by external bureaucracy. Yet their intervention is often decisive because the factions themselves rely on intermediaries to execute actions without provoking full-scale confrontation, creating a situation in which a single individual can mediate disputes, enforce contracts, or manipulate power balances in a community otherwise governed by violence, reputation, and strategic alliances. Engagement with the Kings allows the courier to shape leadership decisions, mediate territorial disputes, and reinforce or challenge the group's authority, sometimes strengthening the cohesion and security of Freeside's dominant faction, while also influencing the welfare of residents who depend on the King's protection. Yet these interventions carry risk, as favoritism or perceived betrayal can provoke retaliation from rival factions, mercenaries, or rogue elements, demonstrating the delicate balance required in the application of influence. Similarly, interactions with the Van Graffs at the Silver Rush have the potential to adjust the economic hierarchy of Freeside, as the courier may assist in acquiring rare energy weapon components, recover stolen property, or eliminate rivals, thereby consolidating the Van Graffs' monopoly and reinforcing their power over residents dependent on energy weapons, while also affecting the broader distribution of lethal capability throughout the district, which in turn influences criminal activity, factional security, and individual survival strategies. Engagements with the followers of the apocalypse allow the courier to directly affect humanitarian outcomes, from securing medical supplies and increasing clinic capacity to mediating the provision of education and treatment for addiction. And these interventions have cascading effects on social stability, public health, and the long-term resilience of Freeside's population, illustrating that the courier's role is not purely tactical or economic, but fundamentally tied to the human dimension of the district. Beyond formal factional engagement, the courier interacts with independent merchants, chem dealers, and local residents in ways that shape commerce, reputation, and opportunity, establishing networks of loyalty, trust, or fear that ripple outward across social and economic structures, and influencing who gains access to resources, who falls into debt, and who is empowered or marginalized in the informal economy that sustains Freeside. The unpredictability of the courier's choices introduces a variable that all Freeside factions must consider in their strategic planning. For the arrival of an outsider capable of decisive intervention disrupts equilibrium, allowing rapid recalibration of power relationships, opening new avenues of opportunity, or exacerbating existing tensions, while simultaneously demonstrating the fragility of authority in a region that relies heavily on informal structures, reputational leverage, and localized enforcement rather than codified law. In effect, the courier embodies the principle that in post-apocalyptic Freeside, a single individual equipped with skill, information, and initiative can exert outsized influence over the political, economic, and social environment, mediating disputes, shaping factional trajectories, and affecting the daily lives of residents from street-level merchants and children to gang enforcers and chem suppliers, producing consequences that echo far beyond the immediate intervention, while also highlighting the contingent nature of power, where authority is constantly negotiated, reinforced, or challenged through action, presence, and perception. Ultimately, the courier's arrival transforms Freeside from a space defined solely by existing factions, scarcity, and historical inertia into a site of dynamic negotiation and possibility, illustrating that even in a lawless quarter at the edge of civilization, the decisions of a single capable individual can influence survival, resource distribution, and the complex interplay of autonomy and control that shapes life in the shadow of the Strip, leaving an enduring mark on the balance of power that governs the district's ongoing struggle for identity, stability, and opportunity. Freeside's fate, precarious and volatile as it is in the present, becomes sharply defined under the divergent outcomes of New Vegas's major power struggles, with each ending reshaping the district's social, economic, and political landscape in ways that reveal the fragility and resilience of its communities. For, under an NCR-controlled Mojave, Freeside is integrated into a structured bureaucratic framework, with patrols, taxation, and infrastructure improvements gradually imposed upon a district previously accustomed to informal governance, leading to the consolidation of the kings as semi-legitimate local authorities, while the NCR's presence imposes new laws, controls over commerce, and regulations over chem use, resulting in improved access to basic services and reduced violence, but simultaneously creating tension among residents who chafe under the Republic's formalization and fear the erosion of autonomy, as many see NCR policies as alien impositions that privilege central authority over local custom, producing a landscape of conditional stability punctuated by residual distrust and occasional skirmishes with those unwilling to assimilate. In contrast, a Caesar's Legion victory transforms Freeside into a zone of militarized order and rigid hierarchy, with Legion enforcers asserting dominance over streets, commerce, and social relations, often through coercion, intimidation, and the imposition of the Legion's draconian moral and administrative codes, which suppress factional independence, regulate trade according to imperial priorities, and demand public displays of loyalty, while the kings, chem dealers, and independent operators must navigate a new order that prioritizes obedience and martial efficiency over local tradition, fundamentally altering the patterns of daily life, trade, and survival in the district, and creating an atmosphere in which freedom is subordinated to conquest and enforcement, with violence and fear serving as both currency and method of governance. Should the yes-man path succeed, Freeside experiences a form of decentralized autonomy, with the district largely left to self-governance under the nominal oversight of the robot-controlled security infrastructure, allowing the kings, Graffs, chem dealers, and followers to maintain their spheres of influence while benefiting from the relative absence of external interference, producing a balance of freedom and order that fosters entrepreneurship, localized authority, and negotiated stability, though persistent scarcity and crime remain, meaning that residents retain agency but must navigate a complex web of interdependent actors, rival factions, and infrastructural limitations, effectively preserving the delicate ecosystem of Freeside while offering opportunities for reform, negotiation, and strategic leverage by influential figures such as the courier or local leaders. In a Mr. House-directed outcome, Freeside exists under the shadow of the Strip's technological hegemony, with Securitrons regulating access, monitoring activity, and enforcing laws on behalf of a central authority whose priorities emphasize economic efficiency, controlled security, and the flow of commerce between the Strip and its border districts, resulting in a district that is both stabilized and constrained, with local autonomy limited by the constant presence of robotic enforcers, yet protected from total collapse by the broader infrastructure and wealth of House's domain, producing a community that is safer and more predictable than under NCR or Legion rule, but one in which residents must continually negotiate access, loyalty, and survival within a highly monitored and technologically enforced order. Across all outcomes, the material and social fabric of Freeside, the survival of children, the operations of the kings, the distribution of chems, the economic dominance of the Graffs, and the ongoing humanitarian challenges faced by the followers remains central to the district's identity, though the means by which stability is achieved, autonomy is maintained, and opportunity is distributed vary dramatically according to the prevailing power, demonstrating that Freeside's resilience is contingent not only upon internal cohesion, but upon the strategies and priorities of external authorities, whose influence shapes trade, security, social norms, and the daily realities of its residents. Each ending leaves an indelible mark on Freeside's culture. NCR's bureaucratic oversight emphasizes integration and rule-based survival. The Legion imposes militarized order and conformity. Yes Man preserves local agency within a framework of negotiated freedom, and House maintains structured technological dominance that balances control with opportunity, illustrating that the district's fate is inseparable from the broader political currents of the Mojave, while highlighting the adaptive strategies, moral compromises, and resilience of the community itself, which must navigate each imposed order to survive, prosper, and maintain its identity. In sum, Freeside's evolution under the major endings underscores the complex interplay between autonomy, external power, and social cohesion, demonstrating that while the environment may change dramatically depending on which faction succeeds, the underlying challenges of survival, adaptation, and negotiation persist, ensuring that the district remains a crucible in which human agency, ambition, and resilience are continuously tested against the forces of power, scarcity, and governance. The future of Freeside, precarious yet persistent, is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of its residents, who inhabit a district shaped by scarcity, factional struggle, and the shadow of the Strip, while simultaneously forging the social, economic, and cultural structures that will determine its long-term survival, for in a post-apocalyptic Mojave, the dynamics of power are fluid, and Freeside exists as a nexus of competing influences, from the authoritarian structures of external powers, like the NCR, Legion, and House, to the informal governance of local factions such as the Kings, the economic dominance of families like the Graffs, and the humanitarian interventions of the followers of the apocalypse, each of which leaves a distinct imprint on the community's trajectory and shapes both opportunity and risk for future generations, whose survival will depend on the ability to navigate these overlapping spheres of influence. Environmental constraints, particularly water scarcity, harsh climate, and the remnants of radiation-affected zones, continue to define the district's viability, requiring innovative solutions for sourcing, storage, and distribution of essential resources, and compelling residents to develop adaptive strategies for agriculture, scavenging, and trade that balance immediate survival needs with the long-term sustainability of the community, a challenge compounded by the unpredictability of the wider Mojave environment, raider incursions, and occasional ecological crises, all of which place continuous pressure on Freeside's already fragile infrastructure and social cohesion. Economically, the district's future depends upon the interplay of informal markets, entrepreneurial activity, and the monopolistic control of key resources, from energy weapons to chems. With families like the Graffs, the operators of gambling halls, and street-level merchants continuing to exert disproportionate influence over wealth distribution, employment, and power, and with the courier or other capable outsiders potentially acting as catalysts for economic shifts, redistribution of resources, or stabilization of key enterprises, creating an environment in which opportunity is closely tied to strategic alignment, reputation, and access to influence networks, while failure to navigate these dynamics can result in poverty, exploitation, or marginalization. Socially, Freeside's population must contend with the enduring consequences of violence, addiction, and trauma, balancing the need for communal cohesion against the pervasive culture of opportunism and self-preservation, and fostering adaptive strategies such as informal schooling, apprenticeship, mentorship within the Kings, or reliance on followers' clinics to mitigate the effects of neglect, addiction, and exposure to violence, ensuring that human capital, knowledge, and survival skills are transmitted even in the absence of formal institutions, a process that both preserves cultural memory and equips future generations to navigate an unpredictable environment. Political and security dynamics will remain central to Freeside's long-term trajectory, as local factions continue to negotiate territory, enforce informal codes, and manage internal disputes while external powers seek influence through oversight, trade, or military presence, creating a constant tension between autonomy and subordination, which will shape decision-making, the distribution of resources, and the enforcement of norms, while simultaneously producing opportunities for strategic innovation, alliance formation, and the exercise of agency by individuals and small groups, highlighting the inherently negotiated nature of power in the district. The district's youth, shaped by exposure to violence, chem culture, and informal economies, will serve as both the inheritors and architects of Freeside's future. Their adaptive capacities, moral reasoning, and social networks determining whether cycles of exploitation and violence persist or are mitigated through innovation, mentorship, and strategic intervention, with the potential for new leaders, mediators, or entrepreneurs to emerge from this crucible of hardship, resilience, and opportunism, bridging the gap between survival imperatives and the reconstruction of a more stable social fabric. Technological and infrastructural factors, including access to energy weapons, robotic enforcement systems, and controlled resources from the Strip, will continue to influence power dynamics, allowing those who master these tools to assert authority and secure survival, while simultaneously introducing dependencies and vulnerabilities that can be exploited by rivals or outsiders, ensuring that adaptation and vigilance remain central to both individual and collective strategy. Ultimately, Freeside's long-term survival will hinge upon the delicate balance of resilience, ingenuity, and negotiation, as residents manage scarce resources, mediate conflict, leverage economic and technological tools, and maintain social cohesion in a district defined by both chaos and opportunity, illustrating the broader challenges of post-war society in the Mojave and revealing how human agency, cultural memory, and adaptive strategy can sustain a community even on the margins of civilization, ensuring that while Freeside may never achieve the order or prosperity of the Strip, it will endure as a living, adaptive, and historically rich quarter, shaped continuously by the interplay of survival, ambition, and the indomitable will of its people to carve out meaning, identity, and hope amid a landscape of scarcity and uncertainty.